The carnival had come to the town centre for the first time in years, and I thought it might be nice for Thomas. He's 5, full of energy, and loves anything with bright colours and noise. It was a warm Saturday, and the air was filled with the smell of hot donuts, burnt sugar, and diesel from the generators. Families wandered between the rides and stalls, kids clutching giant teddies, or gnawing on sticks of pink candy floss. The first time we saw the clown, he was near the waltzers, standing under a string of fairy lights that flickered in the late afternoon gloom. His outfit was cheerful, a patchwork suit of reds and yellows, oversized shoes, and a painted smile. He was handing out balloons to the kids passing by, all tied with bright ribbons. Thomas tugged my hand and pointed, so we walked over. The clown bent low, his gloved hands fishing a balloon out from his bunch. It was red, round and shiny, bobbing as he tied it to Thomas's wrist. We wandered away, and I didn't think much more of it at first. Thomas was happy, bouncing on his heels as he dragged me from one attraction to the next. We went on the teacups, tried our luck at the ring toss, and bought a paper bag of greasy chips to share. I spotted the clown again by the carousel, the cluster of balloons floating above his head like a strange, colourful halo. He wasn't handing them out this time, just standing there, watching the ride spin round. It was only when we came off and started walking away that I noticed Thomas had another balloon tied to his wrist, blue this time. I didn't remember him getting it, and I certainly hadn't untied the first one. Still, it didn't seem worth worrying about. Carnivals are chaotic, and maybe the clown had just slipped it to him when I wasn't paying attention. But then it happened again. Near the coconut shy, there he was, handing Thomas a yellow balloon, and then again by the dodgems, green this time. By now, Thomas had 4 balloons floating above him like a little technicolor cloud. The fairground was busy, loud with music and the hum of voices, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started scanning the crowd more closely, looking for the clown. He wasn't anywhere nearby, not at first, but then I'd catch a flash of color, a hint of red and yellow, just at the edge of the crowd. We went to the fun house next, its entrance a garish painted mouth with sharp teeth and glowing eyes. Thomas darted ahead, clutching his balloons, and I followed, trying to keep him in sight through the maze of mirrors and narrow corridors. That's when I saw him again, the clown. He was standing outside one of the mirrors, his face reflected over and over, each version of his painted grin stretching and warping. His eyes met mine for a second before he turned and disappeared into the maze. My stomach churned, and I grabbed Thomas's hand when we came out, holding on tight. The next time I saw him was at the edge of the fairground, near the old Ferris wheel. By now the light was fading, and the rides were glowing in the twilight, casting long shadows on the muddy grass. The clown wasn't smiling anymore. He just stood there, his balloons swaying gently in the breeze. Thomas tried to pull away, but I held his hand tighter. We turned back toward the crowds, the noise, the safety of people. But no matter where we went, he was there, by the helter-skelter, by the hook-a-duck stall near the food trucks. Finally, I decided it was time to leave. The exit wasn't far, and I kept my head down, dragging Thomas along. He was tired by then, his little legs stumbling as he clutched his balloons. We reached the car park, and I glanced back one last time. The clown was there, standing just beyond the gate, his hand raised in a wave. Thomas's balloons slipped free of his wrist and floated up into the night. The fair rolled into town on a damp Thursday morning, the kind of day where the sky sat low and grey. I passed it on my way to work and noticed the rusted lorries, the faded paint on the rides. It was a travelling sort, the kind that stuck around for a week or two before moving on. By the weekend it was buzzing with people, the air thick with the smells of fried food and cheap beer. The haunted house was tucked at the far end of the grounds, a 2-story structure painted black with streaks of fake blood running down the walls. A battered sign above the entrance read, "The Last Laugh." It was popular from the start, with queues snaking back for hours. People said it was terrifying, like nothing they'd ever seen before. I didn't think much of it at first. A haunted house is just a haunted house, right? Rubber masks and creaky animatronics, a few cheap scares to make you jump. But by the second night, people were talking. A lad from my street, Jason, came back pale as a sheet, muttering about how real it all felt. "Oh, the bodies," he kept saying, "that the bodies looked wrong." I laughed it off, but there was a smell lingering on him, faint but sour, like meat left out too long. The next day, more whispers. A group of teens dared each other to go in and came out quieter than they went in. They didn't say much, but one of them told my mate at the pub that it stank inside, worse than anything he'd ever smelled. By Sunday, kids had started sneaking around the fairground after hours. I suppose that's just what kids do, isn't it? But it was the haunted house they were most curious about. They said the workers there were odd, that they never smiled or spoke unless they had to. At night, you'd see shadows moving inside, long after the rides had shut down. Then came Monday night. I was walking home late, past the edge of the fairground, when I heard a crash from behind the haunted house. A low, heavy sound, like something big falling. The fair was closed by then, the rides dark, and the food stalls shuttered. I almost kept walking, but then I saw the kids, 3 of them, maybe 14 or 15, huddled near the back entrance. They were pushing the door open. I don't know why I didn't shout or stop them. Maybe I thought they'd just run off like kids do. Instead, they slipped inside, one after the other, the door swinging shut behind them. I stood there for a moment, the cold seeping through my jacket, and then I followed. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the smell of mildew and something worse. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, stained with streaks I didn't want to look at too closely. Dim lights flickered overhead, casting jittery shadows that seemed to move on their own. The main corridor led to a series of rooms, each with its own theme. The first was a butcher's shop, complete with hooks dangling from the ceiling and slabs of meat piled on counters. Except the meat wasn't rubber or foam. It glistened, slick and pink, with veins that looked too detailed, too real. The kids had moved on to the next room, their torches throwing jagged beams of light ahead. I should have turned back then, but something pulled me forward, like I had to see. The next room was worse. A hospital, the kind you'd see in a nightmare, rusted gurneys, blood-streaked walls and bodies covered with white sheets. One of the kids dared to pull a sheet back, and the thing underneath wasn't plastic. The skin was waxy, discolored, the eyes half open as if it had been caught mid-scream. That's when the smell hit properly, sharp and rancid like rot. The kids gagged, backing away, but none of us said a word. We moved on, slowly now, the torch beams trembling. The final room was a carnival scene, all bright colors and painted clowns, except the clowns weren't laughing. They were slumped in their seats, their faces slack, their hands dangling. One of them still had a streak of red lipstick smeared across his lips, but it wasn't paint. Behind us, the door creaked. I turned just in time to see a shadow move across the corridor, broad shoulders and a hunched posture. The kids bolted, their footsteps echoing as they ran for the exit. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow stepped closer, the figure dragging something heavy behind it. I caught the glint of metal in the dim light, a blade maybe, or a hook. I didn't wait to find out. My legs finally listened, and I sprinted after the kids out into the cold night air. The fairground was empty, silent except for the sound of my own gasping breaths. The haunted house stood behind me, dark and still, but I swear I saw the door swing shut on its own. The circus smelled of damp canvas, old hay, and grease paint. It had seen better days, decades ago maybe, but now the tents sagged. The paint on the wagons peeled, and the crowds got thinner every week. I joined when I was 16, running from a home that didn't miss me. They didn't much care who you were here, as long as you could pull your weight. I started as a general dog's body, hauling props and setting up stands, until I showed them I could move. After that, they put me on the high wire. People seemed to like watching a girl balance on a thread stretched 20 feet in the air. It gave them a thrill, they said, seeing someone so light, so sure-footed. They didn't know the hours I spent practicing, toes blistered, muscles aching, falling over and over until I got it right. By the time I turned 22, I was the star act. The posters said so in bold letters, the amazing Eliza Queen of the Sky. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I could have kept going forever if it weren't for the fall. It happened on a Friday night. The crowd was bigger than usual, a rare thing, and I felt good, light as air. I climbed the ladder, gripping the pole that steadied me on the wire. The drum roll started and the spotlight hit me, blinding but familiar. The first few steps were smooth, the wire taut beneath my feet. But halfway across it happened, a wobble. Not the usual sort, not something I could correct with a quick shift of the pole. This was sharp, sudden, as if the wire had buckled under me. I don't remember hitting the net, just the sickening drop and the crack of air rushing past me. When I came to, the faces of the troop were looking down at me, all wide eyes and fake sympathy. My shoulder ached where I'd landed badly, and my breath felt ragged, but I was alive. The next morning I went to the rigging. The wire looked fine at first glance, the steel gleaming faintly in the morning sun, but then I noticed the clamp at the end, the one that held the wire to the frame, was loose. Not just loose, but almost undone. I thought about telling someone, but what would I say? Accusing someone outright would get me nowhere. They'd all act horrified, swear it was an accident, and maybe it was. For a few days I kept my head down. My shoulder still hurt, and no one expected me to perform. I watched the others instead from the shadows of the practice tent or leaning against one of the wagons. They didn't know I was looking. That's when I noticed things, little things, like the way Tom, the strong man, would stop talking whenever I walked past, or how the clowns avoided meeting my eyes. I caught the fire eater, Jenny, watching me once, her expression sharp and calculating, but when I blinked, her face broke into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. One night I couldn't sleep. The pain in my shoulder was worse in the dark, and the thoughts circling in my head wouldn't let me rest. I decided to walk to clear my mind. The camp was quiet, the tents hunched like sleeping beasts. As I passed the equipment wagon, I heard something, a faint rustle, the creak of wood. I crept closer, holding my breath. Inside, someone was crouched by the rigging, a figure in the dim glow of a lantern. Their back was to me, but I saw their hands moving, tightening knots, testing lines. My heart thudded as I recognized the silhouette. Before I could step back, the lantern flickered and they froze. Slowly they turned, but the shadows kept their face hidden. I ran before they could say anything, slipping through the rows of wagons until I reached my trailer. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me. The next day, nothing seemed out of place. The troop went about their routines, the same as always, but the wire looked different to me now. Every step I took felt like a gamble, every performance a risk. That night, I climbed the ladder again. The crowd was smaller, but the spotlight was just as bright. My palms were slick as I gripped the pole. The wire stretched ahead, thin and glinting. I took the first step, then the next. Halfway across, the wire swayed. This time I didn't fall, but I knew as surely as I'd known anything that someone was waiting for me to slip. And the worst part was, I didn't know who. It was raining the night I found them, heavy drops pounding the cracked asphalt as I tramped along the side of a country road, my trainers soaked through and my legs aching. I'd been walking for hours, hungry and cold, and then the lights appeared in the distance. Bright bulbs strung high over a sprawling circus, their glow seeping through the misty downpour. I wasn't stupid, not entirely. I knew enough about the world to understand that running away wasn't all it was cracked up to be, but anything seemed better than the house I left behind. And in the rain, the circus looked like salvation. When I stumbled up to the gates, a clown was there, wiping down a table under the striped awning of the ticket booth. His makeup was smeared from the rain, his red nose sitting askew, but he grinned wide when he saw me, showing crooked yellow teeth. He didn't ask many questions, just waved me through and pointed to a big top glowing with light. Inside, the warmth hit me first, a wall of heat, and the mingled smells of sawdust and sugary popcorn. There were more clowns, laughing, juggling, lounging by the side of the ring. They waved, their painted faces stretching into exaggerated smiles. One of them handed me a towel and a dry blanket, muttering something I didn't catch. I didn't care. For the first time in days, I felt almost safe. They gave me a corner in one of the trailers, tucked away from the bustle. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and the thin mattress felt like luxury compared to sleeping rough. For a few days, it was as if I'd fallen into some odd, colourful dream. The performers were kind in their way, offering scraps of food, letting me help with odd jobs around the grounds, but then the cracks began to show. It started with the trailers. Some of them were locked tight, big padlocks clamped on the doors. When I asked about them, the clowns would just smile and shrug as if I'd made a joke they didn't care to explain. Then there were the forbidden zones, areas of the grounds where the grass grew brown and trampled, where the air seemed to shift. They never said I couldn't go there, but the clowns' smiles tightened whenever I wandered too close. One night, when the circus was quiet, I heard something. A low thumping sound, faint but steady, coming from one of the locked trailers. I froze, my heart lurching. The sound stopped, then started again louder this time. The next morning, I saw one of the clowns wheeling a cart towards that trailer. It was piled high with buckets, each one covered with a ragged cloth. I couldn't help but notice the dark liquid dripping down the sides. I tried to keep my head down after that, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The clowns were still kind, still smiling, but their eyes followed me more closely, their laughter a little too sharp. One evening, as I was heading back to my corner, I spotted one of them standing by the edge of the camp. His back was to me, but something about his stillness sent a shiver up my spine. He was staring at the woods beyond, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The clowns didn't go into the woods. They made a point of staying close to the circus, always within the ring of lights. But I was beginning to wonder why. That night I decided to leave. I waited until the camp was quiet, until the laughter and the music had faded. I slipped out of my trailer and crept towards the edge of the grounds. I didn't make it far. A light snapped on, harsh and blinding, and I froze. The clowns were there, all of them, standing in a loose circle around me. Their painted faces seemed wrong in the stark light. The smiles too wide, the eyes too dark. They didn't say anything, just stood there watching. When I turned to run, I stumbled into something hard, a body. Not a person, though, not really. The makeup was smeared, the skin pale and waxy. The thing's mouth hung open, a silent scream etched onto its face. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The clowns stepped closer, their laughter rising, a chorus of high, jagged notes. And then the lights went out. It started with the Ferris wheel. Every summer, the carnival rolled into our little town, parking itself on the edge of the high street where the fields opened up to endless green. The same rides, the same greasy food, the same tacky prizes you'd forget about by morning. It was tradition. You went to the carnival to burn off the heat, spend a tenner on something daft, and maybe flirt with someone you fancied. This year wasn't any different, except for the clown. The Ferris wheel was lit up like a Christmas tree, spinning slowly against the darkening sky. The whole carnival buzzed around it, the shriek of the waltzers, the tinny music from the shooting gallery, the chatter of families and teenagers everywhere. My mates and I stuck together, weaving through the crowds with bags of chips and half-melted ice cream cones. It was Carla who spotted him first, the clown mascot. He stood at the foot of the Ferris wheel, oversized head nodding and waving as kids darted past. His costume was bright yellow, patched in places, and his gloves looked grey with grime. Something about him made me uneasy straight away. Maybe it was the way he moved, quick and jerky, like someone pretending to be friendly but overdoing it. Or maybe it was the grin painted on his face, a permanent, wide smile that felt all wrong under the flickering carnival lights. We kept away from him, mostly. The rides were the main event anyway. Carla and Liam wanted to do the bumper cars, so we split off, agreeing to meet by the Ferris wheel when we were done. There were 4 of us, just enough to feel safe in a place like this, even when you were wandering alone. Except when I got back to the wheel, only Carla was there. She looked nervous, chewing her nails and glancing around like she expected someone to jump out. I asked where Liam and Sophie were, but she just shook her head and said she hadn't seen them since the bumper cars. We waited a bit, watching the crowd thin out as the night dragged on. The Ferris wheel kept turning, its lights reflecting off the glossy clown head at the base. He was still there, waving to no one now, just the empty space beyond the stalls. Carla got fed up first, saying she was going to check the arcade tent. I stayed put, my stomach tightening with that prickly kind of dread you get when you know something's not right, but you can't put your finger on it. The crowd felt different now, quieter, thinner. The sounds of the carnival seemed more distant, muffled somehow, like they were coming from underwater. I don't know how long I stood there before I realized Carla wasn't coming back either. I started walking, through the stalls, past the carousel with its peeling horses, down to the shooting gallery where the stuffed toys hung limp on their hooks. No sign of her, no sign of any of them. The Ferris wheel loomed in the background, its creaking louder now that the carnival had quieted. I found myself walking back to it, drawn in like it was the only thing left that made sense. The clown was still there, but he wasn't waving anymore. His head was tilted just slightly, and even though it was just a costume, it felt like he was watching me. The operator stood slouched by the ride's controls, chewing on a toothpick. I asked him if he'd seen anyone, a tall lad in a black jacket, a girl with a pink scrunchie. He shrugged, didn't even look at me properly, just mumbled something about how kids wander off. That's when the clown moved, not a lot, just a small step forward, but enough to make my stomach drop. His gloved hand stretched out toward me, palm up like he wanted me to take it. I froze. He didn't say anything, just stood there, hand outstretched, that painted grin fixed in place. I backed away, bumping into the operator. He muttered something annoyed, but I barely heard him. My eyes were on the clown. I don't know how long I stood there, heart pounding, before I turned and bolted. The carnival felt emptier now. The rides were still running, but the people were gone. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, lights flickering in time with the distant hum of the generators. I stumbled past the stalls looking for anyone, someone, anyone, but the only faces I saw were painted ones, clowns. Not just the mascot now. They were everywhere, drifting between the rides, their oversized shoes silent against the ground. None of them spoke. None of them even looked properly human. I found myself back at the Ferris wheel. I don't know why. It felt like the only place left. The clown was gone now, but the ride kept turning. My eyes locked on the carriage at the top, and my breath caught in my throat. There was someone in it, just a shape. Slumped over, but I knew it was one of them. Maybe Carla, maybe Sophie. I shouted, but the ride didn't stop. The operator was gone now too. I ran to the controls, pulling at levers and switches, but nothing worked. The carriage went around again, slower this time, and the shape inside sagged further forward. I turned, ready to scream for help, and stopped dead. The clown was standing right behind me. That's all I remember. The next thing I knew, I was standing alone in the field. The carnival lights fading into the distance as the trucks rolled away. I never saw Carla, Liam, or Sophie again. The fun fair arrived one damp Friday in September, rolling into the edge of town like a circus train from some old nightmare. The posters had gone up weeks before, garish, colourful things promising thrills, chills, and unforgettable family fun. That last bit felt like a stretch when I saw the place for myself. The rides were battered and faded, the kind of equipment you'd find rotting behind some industrial estate, and the attractions were hardly better. A few stalls selling candy floss that stuck to your teeth like glue, cheap prizes on the ring toss that no one seemed to win. But Jamie, my boy, begged to go. We arrived just as the sun dipped below the hills. The fairground's lights flickered on, casting the muddy lot in a sickly yellow glow. You could hear the rides creaking over the drone of the generators and the tinny music blasting from crackling speakers. There were clowns everywhere, lumbering through the crowd like they'd been hired off the street. Their makeup looked smudged, hurried, like they'd slapped it on minutes before opening, and their smiles were wide enough to make your stomach turn. Jamie didn't notice. He was pulling at my hand, pointing at the spinning rides and the haunted house with its sagging cardboard cutouts of skeletons. I let him have his fun. It was cheap entertainment, and God knew I needed a night to clear my head. He darted from stall to stall, leaving a trail of laughter that made me feel guilty for doubting the place. When he begged to go on the ghost ride, a rickety roller coaster looped through a shoddy maze of plywood tunnels, I gave in. I stood by the rail, watching the carriages rattle off into the darkness. The operator, a scrawny man in a filthy red jacket, looked half asleep as he pulled the lever. Jamie waved at me as the cart disappeared, his face lit up with excitement. I checked my phone while I waited, watching the minutes tick by. It felt like a long time. The ride was supposed to be short, just a few quick loops and some strobe lights to make you jump. But when 5 minutes turned to 10, I started to feel uneasy. The carriages didn't reappear and the operator seemed to have vanished. I called out, scanning the darkened fairground for Jamie's bright blue jacket, but there was no sign of him. I started asking around, stopping other parents, workers, anyone who might have seen him. Most of the staff just shrugged me off, distracted or disinterested. The clowns were the worst. They'd tilt their heads, staring at me like I was speaking another language. Their painted smiles stretched wider than ever. One of them, his face streaked with red grease paint, held out a hand like he was expecting something. I backed away. Panic started to set in. The lights overhead flickered and buzzed, throwing long shadows across the muddy ground. I found myself circling the ride, peering into the darkened tunnels, calling Jamie's name. It was dead quiet inside, save for the faint sound of chains creaking, and the air smelled like damp wood and something metallic. I spotted an opening where one of the panels had come loose and ducked inside. My torch cut through the gloom, casting weird, jagged shapes against the walls. The track twisted through narrow corridors, the wood splintering in places where it had rotted away. There were props scattered here and there, a rubber skeleton missing its jaw, a dusty plastic ghost hanging limp from a string. It all looked so much worse up close. I kept moving, the sound of my own breathing growing louder in the confined space. That's when I found the first shoe. It was small, a child's trainer with a frayed Velcro strap lying next to the track. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand, my stomach twisting. It was Jamie's. I started shouting then, my voice cracking in the stale air. The ride felt endless, a maze of tunnels that looped back on themselves or led to dead ends. I tripped over something soft and heavy, and my torch landed on it, a pile of clothes, crumpled and smeared with dirt, too many clothes. I couldn't breathe. Somewhere ahead, I heard faint laughter, not Jamie's. It was low and guttural, echoing through the tunnel like it was coming from all directions. I froze, my torch trembling as I swung it wildly around the space. A shadow moved just out of reach, slipping between the wooden beams. Then another and another. The laughter grew louder, overlapping voices that didn't sound quite human. I ran. I don't know how I found the exit, but I burst out into the fairground, gasping for air, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. The place was nearly empty now, the ride still clattering away in the background. The clowns were scattered across the grounds, standing motionless, their faces turned toward me, watching. I called the police. They searched for hours, combing through the ride, the fairground, even the woods beyond. They didn't find him. The ghost ride was dismantled the next day. The fair packed up and gone by nightfall. No one had any answers. The clowns' faces still haunt me. I see them in my sleep, grinning in the dark, their laughter echoing through empty tunnels. Jamie's face, though, that's what I can't bear. It's his smile I dream about most, and the way it was swallowed by the darkness of that cursed ride. He never came back. It all started with a look. The fun fair had come to town, the same as it did every summer. It wasn't much, just a cluster of battered rides and stalls thrown up overnight on the common. But it was something to do. And in a town like ours, you didn't ask for more. My mates and I went down just after sunset, drawn in by the music and the smell of fried onions. We spent most of the evening at the stalls, wasting what little pocket money we had on the ring toss and the coconut shy. The prizes were pathetic. Cheap stuffed animals that smelled like old carpet, but that wasn't the point. It was the noise and the lights, the buzz of people, the way the rides creaked and screamed as they spun. The fair felt alive. It was near the end of the night when we saw the clowns. They'd set up a small stage near the dodgems, a makeshift thing with wobbly-looking boards and a backdrop of painted stars. Two of them were performing, throwing pies and spraying seltzer water, their oversized shoes slapping against the wood. People crowded around, laughing and clapping at the silly gags. I wasn't paying much attention at first. My friends were nudging me to go on the ghost train, and I was trying to come up with an excuse not to. I hated those things, but something made me glance up, and that's when it happened. One of the clowns was staring at me. His face was painted white with a red mouth that stretched up into a cartoonish grin. His eyes were dark, surrounded by thick black rings that made them look sunken and hollow. At first, I thought he'd just pick me out of the crowd, like performers do, but he didn't break the look. Even as he juggled or tipped his hat, his eyes stayed locked on mine. I felt a chill creep up my spine. There was something off about it, like the grin painted on his face wasn't really a grin at all. I told myself I was imagining things, but the longer it went on, the more it got under my skin. By the time the show ended, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The walk home was quiet. My friends had peeled off earlier, leaving me to cut through the high street alone. It wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes, but the town felt deserted, the street lights humming overhead and casting long shadows across the pavement. That's when I saw him. I'd stopped by the newsagent's window, looking at the reflection in the glass more than the display inside. At first, it was just a shape, faint and out of place, standing near the corner where the butcher's shop was boarded up. But as I squinted, the shape took form, a figure hunched slightly with a pale white face and dark sunken eyes. It was the clown. I spun around, heart hammering, but the corner was empty. Just the butcher's, with its peeling boards and broken sign. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that I was spooking myself over nothing, but the image lingered in my mind, the grin, the dark eyes, the painted face. I walked faster. The high street was lined with windows, and I couldn't help but glance at them as I passed. In every one I saw him, not clear, not enough to be sure, but enough to feel the weight of his stare. He was always just out of reach, peeking around corners or standing in shadows, watching me. By the time I turned onto my road, I was nearly running. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and my pulse thudded in my ears. I didn't look back, not once, but I could feel him there, close enough to hear the shuffle of those ridiculous shoes on the pavement. I reached my house and fumbled with the key, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The door swung open, and I slammed it shut behind me, turning the lock with trembling fingers. The house was dark and quiet, my parents already asleep upstairs. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing, my heart still pounding, like it might burst out of my chest. That's when I heard it. A faint squeak, high-pitched and drawn out like the sound of rubber against wood. It came from the other side of the door, slow and deliberate, as if something was sliding down it. I didn't move. My eyes were fixed on the frosted glass panel near the top, the only part of the door that wasn't solid. The light outside cast a faint glow through it, just enough to show a shape, a white shape with black circles for eyes and a wide grinning mouth. The squeaking stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. When I finally found the courage to step away and peek out through the curtains, the street was empty. But I didn't sleep that night. And when I walked to school the next morning, the shadows in the shop windows seemed darker than they should have been. The Clown's Den had been a place my mates and I had joked about for years. You'd hear whispers in the schoolyard, in pubs, and even from your uncle who swore he saw something once back in the 80s. It was supposed to be this cursed little family restaurant that went belly up after one too many accidents, fires in the kitchen, a kid breaking their arm on a faulty carousel, things like that. The kind of story that grew legs and walked on its own, dragging its eerie mystique into urban legend territory. But it wasn't the stories that got us to the den, it was the views. If you're trying to make it as an urban explorer online, you need something grimy, a bit dangerous, and dripping with rumour. The Clown's Den had all of that. Abandoned for decades, its sagging roof and peeling paint seemed to beckon idiots like us, with promises of thrills and a taste of the forbidden. We parked the car a little ways down the road, not wanting to alert any locals who might still have a soft spot for trespassing laws. It was dusk when we arrived, the kind of dusky light that makes everything look grey and flat. The den loomed at the end of the street, its sign half hanging, one red bulb still flickering weakly as if refusing to die. It wasn't hard to get in, no padlocks or chains, just a door swollen with damp. A good shove and we were inside. The air hit me first. It was thick and damp, carrying the smell of mildew and something sour underneath. You could tell the place had been gutted, graffiti covered every surface, broken glass crunched underfoot, and the once bright circus murals were now ghostly figures peeling off the walls. We fanned out, torches sweeping across the debris as we set up our gear. I stuck near the main dining area where remnants of garish red and yellow booths still lined the walls. A carousel sat in the center, its colors faded to a sickly pastel, its horses frozen mid-gallop with chipped faces and missing ears. It wasn't eerie so much as just sad, like a place trying too hard to stay alive after everyone had given up on it. That changed when I found the stairs to the basement. They weren't part of the plan, we just wanted to film the main level. Maybe the office upstairs if we had time, but the door to the basement was slightly ajar and there was a faint light coming from below. I called to the others, my voice low but urgent, and soon enough we were all standing there, staring at that faint orange glow. One of us, Ben probably, muttered something about squatters, and I think we all hoped that was true. A squatter you can reason with. A squatter doesn't need a story we decided to go down. Stupid, I know. But there's a weird energy that builds when you're in a group, like none of you wants to be the one to say, let's not. So we went, stepping lightly, cameras rolling. The basement was warmer than upstairs, the air heavier, almost suffocating. The glow came from a string of candles arranged haphazardly on the floor, their wax dripping into messy puddles. At first it seemed empty. There were some overturned chairs, a filthy mattress in one corner, and what looked like a makeshift kitchen area with rusted cans and a stained kettle. But then my torch caught something in the far corner. Someone was standing there, half hidden behind an old freezer. My first thought was that they were a mannequin. The figure was stock still, dressed in tattered, oversized clothing that might have been white once but was now a mottled grey. The face was painted, a crude clown mask of thick red lines and black circles, the paint cracked and flaking. But as I stared, I realized the chest was rising and falling. The squatter. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly the figure stepped forward, not fast, not threateningly, but enough to make me backpedal into Ben, nearly knocking us both over. The clown didn't say anything. They just stood there, watching us, head tilted slightly like a dog trying to understand a command. That's when I noticed the hammer dangling from their hand. We should have run. Every instinct in my body was screaming to bolt up the stairs and never look back. But we froze, all of us, rooted to the spot as the clown began to walk. Slow, deliberate steps, the hammer dragging along the concrete floor with a metallic scrape that set my teeth on edge. They were blocking the stairs now, and I realized with a sick twist in my gut that they didn't want us to leave. Ben whispered something, and the clown's head snapped towards him. The movement was so fast, so unnaturally sharp, that I felt my stomach drop. Then they smiled, wide and toothy, the paint cracking at the corners of their mouth. The light flickered, and in that split second of darkness, the clown moved. I don't know what happened after that, not really. There was shouting, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, and the sting of glass cutting into my hands as I scrambled to find my footing. I ran. I didn't look back. I don't think any of us did. The last thing I heard as we burst into the night was a laugh, high-pitched, broken and echoing off the walls like it was following us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. We didn't even talk, just jumped in and drove as fast as we could. I haven't watched the footage yet. I don't think I will. I don't need to. The clown's den isn't some ghost story, some silly urban legend you tell to spook your friends. It's real, and it doesn't want to be found.